Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we are a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding, and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation and strategies from the water sector, academia and beyond. In this episode, we're tackling nature-based solutions within flood risk management, also known as natural flood management and sustainable drainage. These solutions are gaining momentum due to their wide-ranging benefits. But what exactly are those benefits? Why has the use of natural flood management grown so rapidly? And most importantly, can it help address the challenge of groundwater flooding? Joining me today to answer the many questions I have on this topic is Dr. Imogen Barnsley, Flood Risk Analyst at JBA Consulting. Imogen completed her PhD on this topic, seeking to answer the understudied question of how natural flood management works in groundwater-dominated catchments, and is completing further research on this topic with Project Groundwater. Imogen, are you okay to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Imogen. I'm a Flood Risk Analyst at JBA Consulting. I started my career at Southampton University, where I completed my doctoral research, looking specifically at how to apply natural flood management methods in groundwater-dominated chalk streams. That was my kind of first real launch into the nature-based solutions realm. After that, I worked for a year as a placement at the Environment Agency, did lots of data analysis and things, a little bit of slant of kind of looking at chalk streams. I was based in the southeast, so we had lots of chalk streams local. And then after my year placement, I joined JBA Consulting and have become part of the Project Groundwater team for the 2 years or so that I've been at JBA Consulting. Been building on the chalk streams and the nature-based solutions right from the beginning.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well, because obviously our favourite line is how understudied groundwater flooding is. Why did this become your PhD? Because obviously I feel like when something's understudied, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy that there's no studies to get people interested in it, and therefore no more studies get done. But you were kind of one of the first to look at this idea of nature-based solutions in groundwater flooding.
Yeah, it came about because my PhD was part funded by the Environment Agency, so that's part of the reason why I then worked with them for a year. They advertised this PhD similar to a job interview. So there's kind of two ways to get into PhD research. You either have your own research topic that you would like to do and you propose that and you get funding, or there are either research bodies or big sort of research projects that already have research questions that they would like somebody to put the time into, and then you basically apply for it like a job. And the Environment Agency, particularly based, like I say, I was at Southampton University, so the rivers Test and Itchen are right around that area, sort of Winchester, Southampton. The Environment Agency basically had big questions about how to manage the rivers Test and Itchen. I was really interested in natural flood management. I was interested in groundwater flooding, but I didn't understand it, much like the rest of everybody. So I really didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know how understudied it was before I was already sort of committed. So for me, it was a really big learning curve, particularly sort of step one of a PhD is to conduct quite a detailed literature review. And I noticed very, very quickly that my PhD pals, were finding a lot more stuff than I was. And I remember sort of month 3 of my PhD, I went to my supervisors and was just like, there's no information. What do I do? And they said, well, this is a really great opportunity. You know, you can be one of the first. You need to kind of look between the lines, find the information that is relevant, and then begin to build a conceptual model. Because if you're not finding that out there, this is your opportunity. So that's what I did. Yeah, I just got my hands on everything. I did some training in hydrogeology. I joined some sort of master's modules, anything that I could get my hands on and read about both chalk streams, natural flood management, but especially sort of the hydrogeology and the chalk geology. Started building a conceptual model from there.
Sounds like that would have been quite daunting.
Yeah.
Especially going straight from an undergraduate into a PhD.
Yeah, for sure.
Like a big jump.
Like I say, big learning curve, very steep.
And we are going to come on to that research in a bit, but first I feel like we should cover what nature-based solutions is, because it's one of those fancy terms that gets bandied about, but actually specifically when we're talking about flood risk management, what do we mean when we say nature-based solutions?
the sort of official definition, which I'm going to struggle to have memorised. Basically, trying to use natural hydrological processes to manage flows within a catchment. That can be everything from reconnecting floodplains, slowing the flow, capturing water within the catchment, managing soils and land use, and everything that goes to have a healthy hydrological function. There are some definitions which kind of include restoration, but in many cases, the river systems that we have in the UK are so managed and so modified. In lots of cases, it's quite difficult to kind of know what state you need to restore something to, because that indicates that you are turning back time. Whereas actually, nature-based solutions are focused on managing systems in a specific way. So it's not always restoration, if that makes sense. Sometimes you are choosing a vision, and that's what you then go for. But again, it's what is generally acknowledged to be a healthy hydrological function. So connected floodplains, soils which are healthy, plenty of vegetation, an ability to capture and store water within the catchment rather than just conveying large quantities of water within the river channels very quickly.
What is a good example of a nature-based solution? What's the common one that you might see quite a lot of?
So the one that everybody loves to research and talk about, leaky woody debris dams. The idea is to add woody debris. That may be sort of log jams, it might be sticks, big clump of sticks, and putting those in the watercourse. They need to be leaky, so they need to allow base flow through. So they need to allow a certain amount of water through. But what they do is they partially block the channel, which raises the water level behind those leaky woody debris dams, which connects the watercourse more efficiently to the floodplain. So it allows the tipping point of water tipping onto the floodplain to happen earlier in a flood peak. And the effect that has by pushing more water onto the floodplain and also increasing the roughness, so the barriers to flow, that slows the flow, but it also allows increased storage of that water and flows on the floodplain, and it reduces that flood peak downstream of a series of those features. That's a classic. They're also really good in terms of ecology, so they allow a range of flow rates in the watercourse. Basically end up with either quick flows over the top of those leaky woody debris dams and also slow flows behind the leaky woody debris dams. And that variety means that there is a greater variety of creatures and vegetation that can then live in those watercourses, because some things will want quick flows, some things will want to shelter in the low flows. They can be really, really beneficial for increasing your biodiversity as well.
Sounds like we're mimicking beavers, which I know is another potential nature-based solution, the reintroduction of beavers, that again can be contentious at times, but it seems like we're just kind of mimicking what would have been happening had those species stuck around.
Very much so.
Those dams.
Also, the thinking behind the leaky woody debris dams is post-World War II in the UK, we really focused on conveyance. So getting as much water and drainage through the watercourses as humanly possible. So a lot of the straightening that we've done to our channels, dredging, that's when those kind of management practices really got entrenched. And what that means is where naturally debris and leaves and vegetation and just dead fallen wood and other things may fall into those watercourses and get trapped, and over time generate a leaky woody debris dam, where we've managed our watercourses very heavily, all of that debris gets removed. So when we're talking about kind of restoration, you may not necessarily have had a leaky woody debris dam in that location, in that river, if you hadn't decided to put it there. But leaky woody debris dams as a feature across watercourses is a natural feature that you would expect in an unmanaged and natural watercourse. That's where that kind of idea of restoration comes in. We're very used to dredging and channel straightening, and for multiple years, so at least 50 years, I'd say it the change happened early noughties and then really got entrenched. So the Pit Review is a really big report that came out in 2007, and that was really big in making nature-based solutions and thinking more widely about ecology and biodiversity and the social benefits of how we manage our watercourses.
As you've been mentioning, like we've seen this shift. You mentioned the pit review brought in the nature-based solutions. It feels like societally we're shifting our views as well. Not maybe as quickly as we are within the flood risk industry, but there's that idea that we have kind of caused our own issues. From climate change through to like flood management, as you said, we focused on conveyance for a long time. We straightened rivers. We saw ourselves as able to control the environment, and now we're sort of having to backtrack and think, not so great. And do you think that's how things are going in the flood risk industry, that we're kind of now thinking like, well, we've done all these things, how do we correct what's been done?
Yeah, I think so. I would agree with that. There's now this acknowledgement that this kind of one-track way of doing things that was entrenched for a good period of time perhaps had some negative effects. And nature-based solutions is definitely trying to roll that back, to try and get back to what we had before we really focused on those for such a long period of time. I think the issue that we have at the moment, so the industry always goes through phases. So there was a real kind of excitement around nature-based solutions. It's very trendy. And now the chatter is very much about, okay, we've decided that we think this is a good idea, but it's not getting as much uptake as some people feel like it should. How do we really market this and make other people really excited and get investors involved and make sure that we can really roll this out on a much wider scale? So I think the FCRIP projects, which Project Groundwater is part of, I think that is the government's acknowledgement of that in a lot of ways. Again, this is my opinion. There's an acknowledgement that we need a bit more information, and we need to be able to give that information to the people who are making the decisions and who are holding the purse strings, basically. Now the real push is on to how do we make sure that this gets implemented into legislation, into sort of funding streams, so that that integrated system that I'm a fan of, that I think is a good idea, gets implemented more widely, and that nature-based solutions can be included in that picture. There are lots of engineered solutions out there and lots of funding streams and things like that. But also there's this acknowledgement, as we have gained more information, as people have done more research. We've had a good sort of 20 years of nature-based solutions, of people being interested in implementing them, trying it out. And then there are some schemes that have been in place for at least 10 years now. So you've got some relatively good data about how they're managing. So now the real focus then is on the additional benefits of nature-based solutions aside from flood risk management, because in terms of absolute flood risk reduction, they may not always be as effective as engineered solutions, because you need space and you need to be able to implement them in a very specific way. You also need to monitor the effects, especially solutions that focus on vegetation. They might take some time to establish, particularly tree planting. You might be waiting for sort of 20 years if you've planted little baby trees. They take a long time to grow and be a proper forest that functions like a forest. There is kind of this delay in the benefits that you may gain. And again, the research demonstrates that they're most effective for smaller catchments and for smaller return periods, whereas engineered solutions are often engineered to a standard of protection up to sort of 200-year return period events or 100-year return period events, which are quite extreme events. You would definitely notice if you had a storm of that intensity. But the benefits of nature-based solutions are much wider than just the flood risk. They provide social value. They provide sort of beautiful spaces that communities can be in and spend time in. They benefit the ecology and the biodiversity. You will introduce so many more species of animals and plants. Wetlands are a really good example of that. They are biodiversity gold mines, and they're also can be very effective at flood risk management. Again, for those lower return period events. They are, in a lot of ways, quite self-sustaining. So whereas engineered solutions, you need to manage them quite carefully for a long period of time, a wetland, once it's established, and it takes time to do it properly, you will need oversight and management to make sure it's established properly. Once it's established, and ensuring that you kind of maintain the water feeding into that wetland, it will then be self-sustaining. The excitement now, as well as talking about funding, it's trying to quantify those additional benefits. Another benefit that people are really big on trying to make sure that we really nail that down about how we can explain it to people, but also monitor post-implementation, is carbon storage. If you manage your land area, if you manage your soils very well, and you've got lots of pore spaces and lots of organic matter in your soils, and they're not compacted and running off straight into the watercourses, they hold a huge amount of carbon. And if you're talking about quite a large catchment area, you can store huge quantities of carbon. So again, when we're sort of talking about climate change and things like that, those additional benefits are definitely, again, in my opinion, I'm the nature-based solutions girl, they're really the way to go, and you won't get those from engineered solutions in the same way.
I love a wetland.
Yeah, me too.
They're great. And I do know that there's that kind of like, the studies are kind of showing now that actually for climate change and for carbon storage, wetlands are far superior to tree planting, but not as easy to get people behind because like it's taking space. Wetlands in some aspects aren't always that pretty. I think they are, but they don't always look exactly like the beautiful. They go through like stages a bit like, sometimes it's just a bit muddy and a bit wet, and we don't really like having wet feet in this country so much, even though we are kind of used to it. You can tell how much I've been I love this topic because I've somehow gone like 20 minutes without mentioning groundwater. But do we actually know what benefits natural flood management has for a groundwater flooding situation?
Good point. For a groundwater flooding situation, no. For my PhD, when I started that in 2017, there was very little research already published about it, pretty much none. A lot of the literature reviews that had looked at nature-based solutions and natural flood management specifically, because that's what I was studying at the time, had specifically mentioned groundwater-dominated catchments as an understudied area where there was no evidence. So it was consistently highlighted as, we understand this about natural flood management, except for groundwater-dominated catchments, we're not really sure. That was a little bit frustrating. And then I started my research. I sort of developed this conceptual model, again, kind of looking specifically at the hydrological processes in groundwater catchments. And I basically theorised that natural flood management is likely to be less effective in a groundwater-dominated catchment. And then I proceeded to try and prove it through some statistics and also some modelling, hydrological modelling methods. I did ultimately come out with that conclusion. We can get into the weeds of that a little bit. And in some ways that's helpful to know, but it's not necessarily very constructive. So when I started at Project Groundwater, we did a literature review. By that point, there'd been a few more years, a few more things to be published. So there were some other studies like the Landwise project, which was led by Reading University and also in collaboration with JBA Consulting. And they also studied applying natural flood management in groundwater-dominated catchments, and they had very similar outcomes to what I found in my PhD research. So for some ways that was quite nice for me because it meant that I knew that I wasn't completely off. The reason is, for Project Groundwater, we've kind of defined traditional natural flood management methods or nature-based solutions, and we've conceptualised what nature-based solutions should look like in a groundwater-dominated catchment, because the processes in a groundwater-dominated catchment are different. Therefore, the solutions need to be different. So because the problems are slightly different, the solutions need to be slightly different. And what a natural chalk stream or a natural groundwater-dominated catchment will be slightly different from a really surface water-dominated, flashy, hilly catchment. They'll have slightly different processes, slightly different problems, so the solutions need to be slightly different. That's where we have landed for Project Groundwater, and more than happy to get in the weeds of where we think we need to be going for groundwater-dominated catchments.
Yeah, definitely. I want to hear about that.
Okay, I think we need to start by trying to get into the nitty-gritties of the processes of groundwater flooding, which is why traditional, in inverted commas, natural flood management may not be as suitable in these catchments. So traditional natural flood management focuses on intercepting surface runoff pathways to capture and store water in the catchment. So it assumes that rain falls from the sky, it lands on the ground, some of it seeps into the soil, but most of it runs across the top of the soil and then straight into watercourses and flows down the rivers very quickly, or it flows across the top of the land and causes issues, flooding of farms, homes, whatever. Groundwater catchments are defined by permeable bedrock. In the UK, we have a lot of chalk. Chalk is very high porosity. It's about 50% porosity, which means it acts very much like a sponge. You've got lots of these pore spaces. And another feature of chalk geology is that often the soils on top of them are very thin. You've got this high porosity bedrock with a very thin layer of soil on top, so very little barrier between the rain that falls from the sky and this big fat sponge. Water falls from the sky, it falls onto the soil, which is relatively thin. Some of it might run off, but most of it will seep into the bedrock. So then that means that there is a delay in how the water moves through that bedrock. It takes a lot longer for water to flow through bedrock, through the chalk, than it does to flow over the top of the ground surface. Catchment storage, so storing water on top of the land surface, is much less effective because actually you already have this huge quantity of bedrock storage and it releases it very, very slowly. This can be a double-edged sword though. So whilst you might not have very frequent, very responsive floods, so if you have an intense rainfall results in a flood a few hours later, you might avoid a lot of those in a chalk catchment, but floods occur at the rate of flow through the bedrock. Over time, that store in the sponge will rise and increase as the sponge or the chalk gets more and more saturated. And as it gets more saturated, it gets leaky, like a sponge would. And that increases inputs into the river, so into the river channels. It also means that if you've got low points, so low valleys, the water may begin emerging in those low valleys. So again, if you imagine you have a sponge and you chop a hole in the middle of the sponge, as you fill that sponge, the hole will also start having emergent water as the sponge gets more and more saturated. It's similar in sort of low chalk valleys. So they rise at the rate of flow, but then they also recede at the rate of flow through bedrock, which is very, very slow. A lot of the problems caused by groundwater flooding are because they persist for so long. So you may have very high flows, or you may have a field that is completely inundated because it's in a low point in the ground, or you may have your floodplain flooded rather than for 48 hours. It could be flooded for 3 weeks or a month or 2 months. And that's a lot of the issues. Also, when you have this kind of subsurface infrastructure, so sewage systems and things, if they're a bit leaky, they can come under real problems from groundwater ingress because you've got that sort of subsurface groundwater rising. It intersects with those pipes. If they're leaky, and then that may cause issues with you trying to flush your toilets. And if you have that issue for 3 weeks or 2 weeks or a month or however long it may take, that makes a real impact on your life. Another thing that we've prioritised is sort of highways in Project Groundwater. Again, generally sort of road flooding, big puddles on the road may be lower priority compared to property flooding for other studies where they're looking at more flashy floods. But again, for us, we're choosing to put it at a higher priority than might be in other studies because you may have an access road flooded for multiple weeks. And then that causes more inconvenience and more issues, but also more damage to the road than it might if it was only flooded for 24 hours.
And I remember I have read part of your studies, part of your PhD, and I saw that there was some potential for some reduction of flood risk. I think it was around 5%, but it wouldn't have any impact on the length of time. And as we see the length of time as the major issue of groundwater flooding, well, there might be a benefit in some areas, but realistically the one benefit we'd really love is to reduce the length of time of flooding, but that isn't something that nature-based solutions that we know of yet, that we've found yet, can have an effect on.
Exactly. My PhD and my research, that is exactly what I found. So you could reduce flood peaks by approximately between 3 and 5%. You could reduce flood durations by 1 or 2 days. And in a normal flood situation where you might have a 48-hour flood, if you reduce the flood peak by 5% and the onset of the flood peak by a day, excellent, you've made a real difference. Whereas when you have a flood event that lasts for 84 days, which was one of the events that I modelled, a reduction of 2 days really doesn't make a material difference. But again, I was looking at those more traditional natural flood management interventions and not necessarily what we're proposing for Project Groundwater.
And how are we proposing to study the outcomes of what we do? So what are we planning to do, and that we know yet what some of the ideas, and how are we going to kind of study that and actually see how it works? Because obviously, as you said, the length of time to establish some nature-based solutions is then quite hard. You would need to be able to study it for quite a long time, I assume.
So what we have done is we have taken nature-based solutions to be a philosophy of managing rivers or catchments and not a set of interventions. So a natural and healthy hydrological function of a chalk catchment requires room to breathe. Because most of the transfer of water occurs below ground within the catchment, trying to intercept overland flow is a little bit futile because the majority of the water that is transferred throughout the catchment happens below ground. Where you know that you have overland flow, so surface water runoff, and that is causing you an issue, absolutely use nature-based solutions to intercept that, but you would need to know specifically that that was causing an issue. The rest of the time, you are more likely to have issues with groundwater emergence, which happens relatively infrequently, but when it does, it happens for a long period of time. This year, so 2024, was a really good example. There was lots of groundwater flooding in the spring of this year. We had very high groundwater levels, and what that resulted in sort of multiple locations was ponding on fields, lots of highway flooding, issues with sewers, and in some of our communities, flooding in urban areas. What we are proposing is, so what we've called it is making space for groundwater. Groundwater levels remain high for a long period of time. So you can reach what is called a steady state flow, where the flows remain high, they remain high for a long time, and they don't really change. And they will only change once the rate of flow through groundwater has changed and the chalk becomes less saturated. So again, that's why you may end up with flood risk that lasts for multiple weeks. Therefore, storing water on the surface, you would need very high volumes of storage to be able to capture all that flow. Confusingly, I know earlier I was talking about conveyance not necessarily being the answer, but actually our conclusion is that making space for water requires those river systems to be allowed to breathe, to allow those flows to flow through the watercourse and not get trapped when the flows do occur. Watercourses in the UK are heavily, heavily modified. The additional complication with groundwater dominated catchments is that groundwater may be high once every 10 or 20 years. And developments and management systems and road networks can pop up in that time. So in lots of cases, we have built in the bottom of those chalk valleys, so where they get really wet and saturated when the groundwater is high. We've also built lots of impoundments. So this may be raised trackways or raised roads, which then previously there was it's called an ephemeral channel. Ephemeral just means temporary. So sometimes it flows and sometimes it doesn't. This is like a really key part of the ecology of a chalk system. There are so many plants and animals and invertebrates and little water bugs that are very happy in chalk streams because they like it to be wet sometimes, but they also like it to be dry sometimes. And they are very rare because they only really occur in those chalk streams. So where we forget, basically, that there's this little valley, and actually, most of the time it's dry and it just looks like a grassy valley. But every 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years, it becomes a flowing river. So if we build trackways across those, then what we cause when that ephemeral channel is flowing, we block off the connection from the top of that channel to the bottom of that channel. And what you will end up behind it is a big pond, essentially, and a big blockage. And again, because that can't drain, unless it drains through the bedrock, it will remain there for a long period of time. So in this example, if that's a road, that then may spill over and cause flooding on that road for multiple weeks. So with Making Space for Groundwater, what we're proposing is to reconnect those sections of those ephemeral channels. So we've spent a bit of time looking at historic mapping. We've spent lots of time looking at where we think these ephemeral channels may be located, and then trying to link those back together. So the Pang is a very good example. It's a rural area. There are fields that flood relatively infrequently, but we do have satellite imagery of them being in flood. And we also have satellite imagery of those raised trackways which are disconnecting those sections of the watercourse from each other. Essentially what we're proposing is to re-establish a river channel through those fields to reconnect those sections of river so that when the groundwater is high, it can function hydrologically connected rather than at the moment a disjointed set of ponds. Another issue that we have is that lots of rural areas get ploughed because they are agricultural land, and where you originally may have had that ephemeral channel, so basically a ditch, over time that will get ploughed in and just not be a ditch anymore. You'll end up with flat land. But that means that when the groundwater does emerge, it spreads over a large area. So not necessarily very deep, but it will then flood a large area for that long period of time. So again, it may not be very, very deep or flowing very, very quickly, but because it's there for a long period of time, it has potential to do a lot of damage. So re-establishing a ditch, basically a watercourse where we think those watercourses originally would have been, will allow, again, when the groundwater is high, for that to function as a river and not just as a series of flat, shallow, large ponds. And it'll also reduce the area that then flows at the time of high groundwater. So it will reduce the coverage, so the extent of those floods when that does occur.
Yeah, it's kind of feeding into that issue of if it's not happening very frequently, we call it the forgotten flooding, and people just sort of forget. And as you said, those ditches, they get filled in. Are we going to be able to study this?
We are going to do our absolute best to get as much data as we humanly possibly can. Project Groundwater has put aside a significant portion of the budget for the nature-based solutions work stream for monitoring. We have an academic partner, so we have a university that we've partnered with, and they will be responsible for the kind of post-implementation data collection and then academic study of what we choose to put in. We also need to remember that we are relatively early days. There currently are not the studies available to demonstrate how well these concepts are that we're proposing. We're quite confident in them in the terms that conceptually they work well, but of course you need evidence and you need data. But that is a real priority of the project. You're right, it's difficult to predict when you may or may not have a severe groundwater flood to kind of see them in action. Part of things that we are currently exploring is additional funding streams. So we have the Project Groundwater project, but that doesn't mean that what we implement as part of Project Groundwater needs to be forgotten at the end of Project Groundwater. We're going to try very, very hard to find additional funding for monitoring to kind of maintain this project into the future. I come from an academic background. Data is really important, and evidence to back up what you come up with is really important. It's a high priority as part of the nature-based solutions work stream at Project Groundwater.
I think our project, alongside Project Groundwater Northumbria and Project Groundwater Greater Lincolnshire, a big part of what we're trying to do is make sure people know that this is an important topic, that this needs to be studied. And I think we're doing well. I think as a Project Groundwater network, we are getting the message out there that actually we should be studying these things should be getting funded. So I would say there's hope. There is hope for future funding.
I agree with that. The project as a whole is in agreement that really needs to be a priority. So it will get there. We're just working on exactly how we're going to access that funding and what exactly that might look like. We're working very closely with Cardiff University and the projects and things that they have planned, and yeah, it'll be exciting. It's just good to know. It's good to know how well these things work. It may turn out that thinking positively. They might be excellent and brilliant, and we've got loads of evidence that demonstrates how perfect they are and that we should do this for the rest of our lives in the south of England in all of the chalk catchments. Or it might be a little bit more murky or a bit more of a grey area. Or we may discover that, depending on how we choose to measure it, it hasn't worked as well as we might have expected. All of that is good to know. We need to know the information to be able to plan accordingly and to manage these systems appropriately in the future.
Definitely. Always like to end these podcasts with asking the expert on if there's anything you think we've missed when it comes to talking about nature-based solutions, because you know far more than me. Is there something you think we haven't covered that we should?
I think I would reiterate, in my opinion, nature-based solutions need to become more integrated into the kind of catchment management system. Nature-based solutions can really focus on rural areas, and at the moment there is quite a compartmentalisation between natural flood management officers and people who work in natural flood management and sustainable drainage people. And we do talk to each other and we try and work together, but ultimately at the moment they are different disciplines, and a bit more connectivity between those two so that we can manage the rural areas in conjunction with the needs of the urban areas and vice versa, I think will help a lot to more of a systems approach where you take the whole thing into account. And I think that can have some real benefits in the future, and also, integrating the sort of engineering solutions that we have. So at the moment, we, again, in terms of research, we might research the benefits of natural flood management just downstream of the natural flood management scheme that we've put in. Whereas I have seen some really interesting research that I really like, looking at sort of catchment scale natural flood management in rural areas, SUDs implemented in urban areas, and then measuring the deployment of engineered solutions and how those things interact, and using that as evidence to support sort of nature-based solutions to basically demonstrate that they've implemented this huge catchment-wide area and it's had an effect on how they manage those engineered solutions when they need them, and what a benefit that has been. And I think taking that whole system and looking at how they interact is both really interesting and really exciting, but also is, in my opinion, the future of where we're going, or where we should go.
And of course, SUDS is sustainable drainage. I'm quite impressed we got so far without using an acronym. But yeah, so using all three in one area.
Yeah, and not looking at them in isolation, looking at them as a system that interacts with each other, because they do.
Amazing. So I'll be adding links to your research in our episode notes. So if anyone is interested in the more technical approach, they are technical, I would say. And if you understand many of the words, go for it. I struggled a little bit, but I'm much more on the chatty side. And I got the pleasure of actually being able to ask my questions rather than have to figure them out for myself from the research. But Imogen, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and I feel very lucky because it was such an area of interest for me to have had this time. And thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. So we're a new podcast looking to grow, so hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising, or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. And that's all for now. We will be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.